Hey guys. All right. So, as I promised, we are now talking about sensory integration for the physical therapist. So, let me share my screen. Okay. So, in talking about sensory integration, I think it's good to go back and kind of review the sensory system, but we're going to do it in an overly simplified way. Um, so, the sensory system it's you get input detected from the environment or your own body. That input is then transferred to the spinal cord, taken up to the brainstem. The brainstem has to screen it for danger. So if it's something that's really hot and you want to take your hand off of the stove, that's something that they want to screen for first. And if it is detected to be dangerous, then the brainstem pushes it right back down and tells the body to react to it. If it's determined that it's not dangerous, then it goes to the thalamus, which is the second filter, to decide if it's important information or not. Do we need to react or respond to it, or can we just put it up there in our brain and say, okay, it's here, but we don't need to do anything about it? If it's important information, it goes to the cortex, which then discriminates what the input means and gets the details about it. And then it tells the body how to react to it. Okay, so remember your ascending pathways. You have the dorsal column, medial lemniscal tract, which carries your touch information. So discrimination, like is it sharp touch, dull touch, deep touch, light touch, what kind of touch is it, and localization, where, and how much pressure, vibration, and proprioception. So that travels up the brainstem through the thalamus, crosses at the medulla, ends at the somatosensory cortex, and this is your fast track to the cortex. Then you have your anterolateral spinothalamic tract, and this one is the one that's going to detect pain, temperature, light or non-specific touch. And this is going to ascend from the spinal cord right to the thalamus. It's the slow track to the cortex because it has to be stopped first to see if it's something that needs immediate response. But this is the track that's used more frequently. It has tons of branches into the brainstem, so it can filter the information quickly and produce the response if needed. All right, so what comprises our sensory system? Well, we know about tactile and auditory and visual and oral and olfactory. Um, but there's also the vestibular system, which is considered the boss because the vestibular system hooks into all the other systems and tells them what to do. It integrates all the information. The vestibular nuclei is the first place for information to cross from one side of the body to the other. And then we also have our proprioceptive system and interoceptive system. So actually, if you look in research, there's some people that can name like 25 sensory systems, but these are the big players, the most important ones that we'll talk about. So sensory integration just said inefficient neurological processing, and the child had difficulty responding to the sensory input that they were receiving and behaving in a meaningful way, something that was appropriate for what they were experiencing. And this disorganization of this input was thought to affect learning. And let me go to the next slide. And so it's been refined in the 80s to be described as the neurological process that organizes sensation from one's own body and from the environment. It makes it possible to use the body effectively within the environment. And it was historically thought to be a software problem where, the hardware in the body and the brain and everything was working properly. It was just the processing of the information that was the issue. Although we're going to see some research that is starting to debunk that. And currently now it's called sensory processing disorder. So we'll continue to call it that, but in case you come across sensory integration disorder, that's like the original name. Okay, So sensory processing disorder, it's not a standalone diagnosis yet. The DSM-5 doesn't recognize it. And, depending on the doctors that you talk to, some of them think it's a bunch of hooey, and some, believe in it. So that can lead to some problems getting treatment or getting parents to be heard if they're going to a doctor that really doesn't think it really is something. So like I said, there's new research that has been able to detect abnormal white matter, primarily involving the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the way the cerebellum connects information to the brainstem and to the cortex in individuals with sensory processing disorder with no other comorbidities. And they found that there's a lot of carryover between individuals with autism spectrum disorder and sensory processing disorder in the places where this white matter is affected in all areas except the social emotional processing, where the kids with autism spectrum disorder have more issues with the white matter than do the kids with sensory processing disorder. Often in the clinic or out in the public, you'll hear, the child has sensory issues, but that really could mean anything. So it might be up to you to figure out what that means and how to best tap into this child's sensory system in order for them to really be available to learn during your sessions. Often these kids are seeing, an OT, speech, there's a team involved, but it depends on your setting. If you're in early intervention there and you're not in a school system, you might not have access to all the other providers to kind of work together as a team, or you might be the only provider. I worked in a school for kids with autism, and the two OTs that were hired one year were both brand new out of school, and their experience with sensory processing disorder was limited. So I pretty much had to take on that role because I had a little bit more experience with it. So sometimes, it is up to you to kind of be the charge. All right, and who is at risk? So it's about 5 to 10% of the quote unquote typical population are kids who may have a sensory processing disorder. 30% of kids with sensory processing disorder also have other diagnoses. And it's really common we see in premature infants. So you learned in a lecture that the largest amount of neurosensory development occurs between 24 and 40 weeks gestation. So if you have a baby born at 24, 25, 20, 30 weeks, they're missing out on that nice quiet, dark area of the uterus to really develop their nervous system. And now they have an immature nervous system, and they're being put into this NICU that is like sensory overload. You have lights that are sometimes blinking, lights that are on 24 hours a day. You have sounds coming from the monitors, from the staff, from parents, from other babies crying. There's constant handling, and these babies are shown to have a decreased amount of REM sleep, and they're constantly getting needle pricks too. So it is like sensory overload for these poor little underdeveloped nervous systems. The autism population depends on the literature, but it's about, they say 90% of kids with autism spectrum disorder also have sensory processing disorder. There's a big debate going on now that if it's so much of the population, is it just a characteristic of autism in these kids, or is it a separate diagnosis or separate condition? So that's not really clearly defined yet. And 40% of kids with ADHD have some type of sensory processing disorder. And there's also, debate that kids with ADHD are on the higher functioning end of the autism spectrum disorder, so that would kind of make sense. And then, some kids who have genetic disorders like Fragile X, are more likely to have some type of sensory processing disorder or issue. Okay, so SI theory has some assumptions. So one, and the first one, the most important one, is the CNS is plastic, and it's plastic throughout the lifespan. And sensory integration develops. It's not something that you're born inherently having. The body needs experience in the world for the brain to really start interpreting what all the information means. The brain functions as an integrated whole. It has to have communication through all parts of the brain in order for things to work effectively. The CNS is designed to seek or avoid sensory info that is necessary to be organized. And humans have an inner drive to develop sensory integration through participation in sensory motor activities. An active participation, that it must be purposeful and goal directed. It has to be the just right challenge for a child. So these are the SI theory assumptions. Now I'm going to play a little video, really crossing my fingers over here that it works, but I will post all the links to the videos that I play in case it doesn't play right.
Hi, my name is Neil. I like classical music. I like to read comics. I also like to go to school. Something that I know a lot about and want to tell you about is sensory processing disorder. SPD is when the messages that your brain gets from your senses are not organized, so you don't respond to things like most people do. This makes it hard to do everyday life stuff like getting ready for the day, going to school, eating, and playing. You can have SPD by itself, or you can have it with other things like autism. I have autism and SPD. Everyone has 7 sensory systems. They are sound, taste, smell, vision, touch, proprioceptive, and vestibular. Under-responsive versus over-responsive. You can think of each your sensory systems as being a cup, and water is that type of a sensory input. If you are under-responsive to a certain sensory input, it is like you're a big, huge cup. You keep getting water to the big cup. You can just keep adding, but it never feels full. But if you are over-responsive, it is like you are a tiny cup. All you need is just a little sensory input and you overflow. You want your cup to be full and not spill over. Each of your sensory systems is their own cup and they are different sizes. Just because you have one big cup does not mean you are under-responsive with all your senses. I have a big cup for my proprioceptive and vestibular senses and a little cup for my touch, sound, taste, and smell senses. Everyone is different and unique. Some days and times of days are good, and some are too much for me. I don't like loud and busy places. I cover my ears and want to run away or yell and tell everyone to be quiet. I need less noise to feel in control of my body. I like to always be moving. I have a hard time holding still. I don't like people to touch my skin sometimes. But everyone is different. My brother doesn't mind if people touch him, and he does not need to wear sunglasses. It is important to know your own body and to understand your body and your 7 senses. Sound. We get the sense of sound through our ears. When the sound is loud, I can't concentrate of anything except stopping the loud noises. I have a really hard time when my mom's turn on the vacuum or blender. Our eyes are how we use our sense of vision. people like bright lights and lots of things to look at. I get distracted if there's too much to look at. I like things soft colors and organized. When I walk outside, the sun is always so bright that it hurts my eyes and I can't look up. I wear my sunglasses when I'm outside to help. Touch. Some people don't like to be touched, and I don't like my hands to be messy. It makes me feel bad. Touch is your tactile sense, and if you are not used to having things touching your skin, it can make you feel uncomfortable sometimes. Certain clothes, tags, and shoes can really feel not right for an opinion. For most people, their brain gets used to that uncomfortable clothes. But for me, I just can't think of anything else but the tag that is bothering me. I will tug on it and want to take it off the whole time I'm wearing it. We are trying to teach my hands that it is okay for them to be messy for a little while. The more I can play with things that are a little messy, the more I get used to it, and my brain learns not to focus on it as much. Proprioceptive. You can think of proprioception as your body awareness. You get proprioceptive input every time you get input through your muscles and joints. It sends a message to your brain that says, this is where I am and this is what I'm doing. You get proprioceptive input to help you do everything your body wants to do. Like pushing yourself on a scooter board, carrying something heavy, or even getting dressed. By doing more with your body, you can get more proprioceptive input. This helps me feel better. When I feel like my body is out of control, I like to jump, scooter board, or getting wrapped up tight in a blanket. Proprioceptive input helps me to calm down and organize my body. Vestibular. Your vestibular sense is super complicated but super cool. We all have something in our inner ear that tells the brain whether we are balanced and whether we are moving. It tells our brain whether I am right side up, upside down, moving forward, or moving backward. It is what tells us that we are dizzy and better stop spinning. If our brain is our sense is very important to help us do everything we need to throughout the day. To figure out what your needs are, it helps to go and work with an occupational therapist. I have 2 of those, one here and one at school. I go to OT 1 time a week. Katie and me and my mom gets to do fun things together when we go. When I leave, my body feels better. It feels like I am in control. We work out our muscles and our brains. Katie and my mom like to talk about things for us to try at home and school. If you have a hard time with your sensory input, there are a lot of things you can do to make it better. There are activities to help your brain learn how to respond differently to sensory input. You can help your body feel calm and in control by getting the sensory input you need throughout the day. Your parents, teachers, and occupational therapists can help. To learn more about
Okay, so that is a short view of sensory processing, and you'll learn that he's kind of more talking about modulation disorder, but we're going to get into what all that means now. So a sensory processing disorder becomes a disorder when it results in functional problems. We all have little issues that maybe we need to tap our feet to fidget to keep us kind of awake in class, or some people are really sensitive to the person next to them tapping their pen on the desk. We all have little issues that kind of tweak our sensory systems. Hope not twerk, definitely tweak. But we're still able to function in life. You can still go to class and learn what you need to do and have a job and take care of yourself. It's when it starts to get in the way of these the ability to function in a daily life that it becomes a disorder. So it's broken up into three categories. So we have sensory modulation disorder, and the terminology in the purple writing I included just because if you are reading research uh, having to do with autism spectrum disorder, a lot of times, unfortunately, they use different language to mean the same thing. So you might also see it written as sensory reactivity. But for the purpose of this lecture, we're going to continue to call it sensory modulation disorder. That's one. A second type is sensory discrimination disorder, or you might see it as sensory perception and discrimination. And the third type is sensory-based motor disorder, and you might see that as praxis postural control. Now, these disorders are not mutually exclusive. You can have sensory modulation disorder and sensory discrimination disorder. You can have sensory-based motor disorder and sensory modulation disorder. You can have all three. So you can see how there's overlap. Some kids will have all three, one, or two. Okay, so now we're talking about sensory modulation disorder. So in these kids, there's no physical issue in detecting the input from either their body or the environment. There's no hearing impairment, no vision impairment. There's nothing wrong with their sensation, but the body is not responding appropriately to that stimulation that it's getting. Has difficulty modulating, modifying, or controlling what's coming in and prioritizing the input, and the resultant behavior does not match the level of stimulation that the body received. So with this sensory modulation disorder, this is broken up into three subtypes. So we have sensory over-responsivity, which is what the little boy in the video was talking about, these three subtypes. You also might see that as hyperreactivity, or sensory under-responsivity, or hyporeactivity, or sensory seeking. And just like with the types of sensory processing disorder, you can be over-responsive in one sensory system and under-responsive in another, vice versa. So this is what our kind of daily life looks like. So when we wake up, we're kind of in that low arousal zone. We're a little sleepy, we're a little tired, we're walking around slowly. We're not really, unless you're like a super awesome morning person, you're probably waking up in this low arousal zone. So then you might, walk around a little bit, have some coffee, eat some breakfast, and that it spikes your arousal into that calm alert state where you're organized and you're kind of more awake and ready to start the day. And then, throughout the day, you might teeter back and forth, but still kind of in that calm alert state. So, towards lunchtime, you might start dipping down a little bit, getting a little sleepy, and then you have lunch and you spike back up again. And then you hit that like afternoon lull and you have a cup of coffee and it spikes you up again. But then something might happen like, towards the end of the day, you might have a deadline that you have to meet for work and you have all this work that has yet to be done. And it's almost 6 o'clock and you have to leave to pick up your kids from daycare. So now you're in this high arousal zone, you're high stress, hyper vigilant. And that's the type of thing where, somebody like will ask you something really innocuous and it just sends you over the edge and you might, so you might be a little irritable. But then you get your work done, you're able to leave, you pick up your kid, and you just naturally go back down into that calm alert state until, maybe later on that night, you wind up in that low arousal zone again when you're ready for bed. But we're able to kind of get ourselves into that calm alert state. Even if we have an experience that sends us out, we have ways to cope and get us back in. All right, so basically for all the sensory modulation disorders, we're going to be treating by tapping into the dorsal column tract. And that's using tactile, specifically deep touch, proprioception, and vestibular. But we're going to use it differently for the different types. So let's go over. So now we have sensory over responsivity, that hyperreactive. So that's the little kid with the tiny cup and the water overflows with just a little bit of water. So these kids start off the day in that high arousal zone. They're already hypervigilant, they're hyperreactive. Um, doesn't take much to really kind of set them off. Okay. So these kids feel bombarded by input. So they could have tactile over responsivity where their clothes, they never accommodate to their clothes. They feel that tag all the time, or the seam on their sock, or their underwear just doesn't sit right. Thank God a lot of clothes now are made with those painted labels. They have seamless socks, seamless underwear. So there's a big market for clothes geared towards, kids who have sensory over responsivity. So there's that option as well. Of course, they tend to be a lot more expensive, but they're there, they're available. So kids with tactile sensitivity might also have trouble walking on grass or sand. You might see them go up on their toes. These kids might be uncomfortable holding hands, which can become a safety issue if you're walking in a parking lot or crossing a street. Some kids with visual over responsivity have difficulty in rooms where the lights are really bright or the sun is shining, especially if the sun's like going through trees and it gives a little bit of like a strobing effect. Fluorescent light bulbs, to most of us, we don't really notice anything, but there is a very quick flicker in fluorescent light bulbs. And some kids with visual sensitivity can sense that flickering. They do sell these drapes that go over, kind of like a upside down tent over the lights. So it kind of blocks out that flickering for kids. Kids with auditory over responsivity are very sensitive to sound. So you might see them cupping their ears or, rocking their head back and forth or running out of a room if it's just too loud. The toilet bowl is a huge trigger for these kids because it's already echoey in a bathroom, especially the public bathrooms with all the tile. And then you get this loud industrial strength toilet bowl that that sends kids running out of the bathroom. You can be oversensitive to smells, olfactory sense. And this is what I was talking about in the behavior lecture. How a child might be aversive to somebody wearing perfume and might want to avoid, going to a session or, work with that person. Even food smells, that might cause them to not want to eat certain things because of the aversion to the smell of the food. With taste, if they're over responsive, these kids tend to be picky eaters. I always describe it as having the white food diet. So a lot of starchy things. They'll love crackers and pretzels and goldfish and maybe chicken nuggets, and that might be the extent of their food repertoire. They have vestibular over responsivity. They're going to fear with just a little bit of movement, like swings are going to be out of the question. Even just rocking on a rocking chair might make them feel like they're going overboard. But these kids, you might see a fight or flight reaction, aggression, fear, anxiety, and they're going to try to avoid or escape and get out of that sensory input. I have a little video that kind of gives you an experience of how it's like to have some sensory over responsivity.
1 minute, I'm just going to get a ticket, okay? Alex, just 1 minute.
okay, that's enough. So after that, he goes outside and calms his breathing down. But that, I mean, that can evoke anxiety in just about anybody. You can understand how that could be just a very stressful experience for a child like this, whereas, we would go through this and be like, why is your child behaving that way? What's wrong? Why, they won't even let you get a ticket. And meanwhile, the world is just bombarding them. So how do we intervene for kids with these sensory over responsivity issues? So we don't want to avoid vestibular input if they're having an over responsivity to vestibular, but we do want to kind of get their system to be able to handle it. So we introduce it in slow, rhythmic ways that's predictable in the movement. So we'll start with linear movement, vertical movement first, and then horizontal. So even like a little jumping on the trampoline, or horizontal might be just going straight forward and back on a scooter board. Orbital movement is the next most kind of intense after that. And that's not spinning. That's like if you think about the scooter board kind of going, traveling in a circle. Then you have rotational. And the most intense is inversion, so actually being upside down. So you want to start with the least intense, and then as the child is able to accommodate to it and able to tolerate and handle it, then you move on to the more intense. That's not to say you're doing that within a session. They're not going to tolerate linear and horizontal and orbital and rotational all in like, a 10-minute time period. This is going to take time. But if you do it in slow and predictable ways, then the child might not go into that panic response. So if we provide proprioceptive input, this is very organizing for these kids. So any type of heavy work, pushing around a laundry basket full of clothes or books, putting on a weighted vest or a heavy backpack. TheraBands can provide proprioceptive input. Weighted blankets, which is kind of like trending right now, or weighted animals, which I usually give you guys an example to feel, but we can't do that now. But they have these like nice, really heavy animals in either like snakes or dogs or whatever. And you can put them over a child's lap while they sit in class, or put them over their shoulders. And it gives that proprioceptive input that's very calming. You might have to consider using soft lighting, like I said, those tents over the fluorescent lights, or using visors or sunglasses if they're sensitive to light. Noise canceling headphones are used for some kids with, nothing being played in the headphones. It's just to hold and kind of muffle the loud noises that they're interpreting. And transitions are going to need to be predictable, because if you can imagine, if you know that your body gets bombarded by these senses and somebody's saying, okay, now we're going to move over here, you're going to be very wary of what's going to happen to me. What kind of environment am I going to be put into? So you really need to have the child understand what they're going to, what's to be expected. As far as food, the picky eater, there is a whole protocol for for introducing different types of textures and flavors of food. And that's not really something within our scope of practice, but just to know it's out there. And it's usually starting with some, blander foods and softer texture, and not as smoother textures, and then moving more towards crunchy and hard, and then like the real like goopy stuff like cottage cheese and stuff like that. That might be a little more gross to these kids. So that's more for sensory overreactivity. So I'm going to show you some examples of things. So this lady at the top left has a type of band that it's a like resistance. So you put it around your body like that. You could put it around while you're sitting in a chair, and that gives that proprioceptive input and calming input while you're sitting. You can use this for kids in a classroom while they sit. You can make a kind of calming down corner where they can choose one of these things to use if they feel the need that they're getting a little overloaded and they need something to help calm them. Um, this body sock is in the middle, and that also gives like full body proprioceptive input. You can even have the child put their head in, and it kind of feels like a little bit of a cocoon. They can push against it, they can move in it, you can sit in there and read a book. This child on the right, top right, has a weighted vest. There's a protocol for that too. It depends on body weight. There's a certain percentage of body weight and how long to wear it at one time and how many times throughout the day. And that is to help kind of give that proprioceptive input to your body, but in an intermittent type way, so you're not accommodating to it. The bottom right is a example of a weighted animal. So this little, looks like a shark or a dolphin that's around this child's neck. And this is a little blow up cocoon that gives full body proprioceptive input as well. Now, this is a full body roller. And this was actually invented by a woman named Temple Grandin, who is an adult with autism spectrum disorder. She's a cattle rancher. And if you have the chance to read one of her books, it is an amazing resource because she has such a way of explaining how her brain works. It really opens up all these windows. It really gives you a good window into seeing how her brain operates. It's fascinating. But she found that these cows who were, it's gross, but going off to being slaughtered, would go through these little like squeezy things, and it would calm them if they were agitated. So she went through it herself, and she found that it was calming to her as well. So she made up this machine so that she could do that for herself when she found she was agitated and she needed to be calmed. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the sensory under responsivity, the under responsive kids, those hyporeactive kids. These kids start out the day in that low arousal, and kind of no matter what they do, they stay in that low arousal zone. They just can't get up to that calm alert state. Okay, so with these kids, they have a decreased response to stimuli. So whereas the other example in the video, that boy was seeing, I mean, the lights were like flashing, every little sound was super loud. With these kids, it's almost like they're not even noticing stuff going on around them. It's just they're so under responsive, they don't even feel it or see it or notice it. So these kids might appear sluggish, low energy, couch potato like. And if you think of yourself kind of in that morning stupor where you haven't totally woken up yet, you can kind of imagine how it is to be like that all day long. These kids might appear socially withdrawn and prefer solitary play, and it's not because they don't want to be social, but when they see all the kids playing around them, and they're all moving quickly and going from one thing to another, and by the time these kids kind of figure out where they need to go and how they're going to get there and getting their body organized to do it, the kids have moved on to something else. So it almost becomes like, oh, it's just easier if I just sit by myself and play with something. With these kids, you have to be cautious of issues with pain and temperature because they might not be interpreting it correctly or quickly enough. So a kid that falls, might not recognize that they're hurt, or if they're filling up their own bathtub or starting the shower, that's if it's your child, you might want to check that water temperature to make sure it's not too hot and it's going to burn them. These kids might not respond to their name, or they might need directions repeated more than once because they're not responsive to that verbal input, the auditory input. So they might need a couple repetitions for that to kind of process and, until they understand what they need to do. Their clothes may be messy in the fact that, if you can imagine your pants on and they're like twisted a little bit, how annoying that would be to you, and you would want to fix them right away. Whereas these kids might not be getting that input that something's off. So they might leave their pants like twisted around half the day, or their shirt is, all messy and all over the place. They might bump into things. They don't notice that they're bumping into it. They don't realize how close they are to things. And they might leave food on their face because again, they don't feel it there, so they don't realize they need to wipe it away. Okay, so what do we do for kids who are under responsive? So we want to use a multimodality approach. So if you're trying to call their name or give them directions, instead of just talking to them, you might also make sure you put your hand on their shoulder or get in front of them and use eye contact. So you're using touch, vision along with the verbal. So you're kind of now you're bombarding them with input, so it's enough for them to respond to. When it comes to giving vestibular input, this is the opposite of those over responsive kids. So we want it to be fast. We want to use those intense rotational, orbital, inverted movements. It should be non-predictable because you really need to kind of wake up that system and not like lull it back to sleep. When we're giving tactile input, we're going to use different textures. So on the floor, you might use a sensory walk. A ball, instead of using a regular ball, you might use a ball with little spikes on it. Not real spikes, you know what I mean, those spiky sensory balls. So just introducing more sensory input to the things that they're already doing. If we're giving proprioceptive input, you can introduce things like a jungle gym, the weighted vest, like we were talking about before, the resistance bands. If you're playing ball, I might use a weighted ball, so it gives them that input as well. Visually, use bright colors. You can play music with varying tempos. The vestibular system is really hooked up into your ear as well. So music with varying tempos kind of stimulates your vestibular system as well. And if you're having them work on a task, you might want to do this 2 to 5 minutes of sensory input right before the task. So they're kind of getting into that calm, alert, awake state and then ready to participate. These kids in class might need frequent movement breaks or jobs in the classroom requiring heavy work. This might be the kid that I say, to the teacher, can you make it his job carry the basket of library books back to the library when it's time to go, because that's nice heavy work that will give him that proprioceptive input. The frequent movement breaks will allow him or her to kind of wake up their system, get into that calm alert state, especially before they need to sit down and maybe do some seated work at a desk. All right, now we have the sensory seeker. So these guys are interesting because they start out in that low arousal zone. And then they start craving or seeking some movement or whatever input they're seeking to get them a little bit more awake and alert. But what happens is the more they get, the higher they go. They don't really stay in that calm alert state. They wind up going into that high arousal state. So that craving of that movement winds up going too far. Okay, so these kids are constantly on the go. They're crashing into things. They're jumping. They're hanging on things. These are things you kids you see like jumping onto the refrigerator and hanging on the top of the refrigerator. They tend to be disorganized and impulsive. These are the kids that there is a a safety issue going on here. They might run right out into the parking lot after you get out of the car. These kids might touch everything. Humming or making noises, that humming also kind of gets into that vestibular system, which is, part of what they're craving. They might mouth things past the appropriate age, whether it's, toys or clothes or food. They constantly need that sensory input to their mouth. They have a high threshold for input. And these are the kids that the parent or the teacher might report that they're disruptive in class, they're unsafe, they might be rocking on their chair so far until the chair falls over and then they knock over 2 other kids, in the way. They might be disruptive to the point where they're not able to learn themselves, or they're causing such a disruption that there's other kids around in the classroom that are having trouble learning because of the child. And their behavior might have a social impact. Like kids, at a certain age start to recognize like when somebody's not behaving the way that they're used to. Like I said before, this quest for input often winds up causing more dysregulation. So here's a little video of, this is Malachi. So Malachi is trying to watch a TV show. So that lasted about 4 seconds. And he's already scared one dog off of the couch. So you see just the frequent movement. And now we're kind of smashing the blanket into the face, smashing the face into the couch. We're rolling on the couch, throwing things. Now he comes off the couch. Oop, now we're crashing our head back into the couch. And now you see him biting the blanket. He's getting that input that way. Getting super close to the TV, getting that visual input. And now inverting, now he's crashing onto the couch. Now we're upside down, inverting our head, still biting on that blanket. Now this other dog is like, oh, I'm out of here. They know now he's rolling. You got to feel for these kids because it's almost like they're uncomfortable in their own skin. They can't feel right. They just don't feel organized. Now we're stomping the feet, trying to get that proprioceptive input by stomping. And more back to the TV screen and the bright lights and back to crashing into the couch. So I think you get the idea of what a sensory seeker looks like from that video. And that's really typical. Okay, so we talked a little about what sensory seeking behaviors look like. So when children are seeking vestibular behaviors, you might see spinning, rocking, head banging, humming, like I said, is that inner ear that gets to that vestibular system. Ear flicking, so they flick their earlobe, that makes a sound that kind of echoes in their ear that gets to that vestibular system. They might wander or pace in the classroom. Like I said, they might invert their head like that Malachi did in that video. When kids are seeking proprioceptive input, you might see them crash into the walls, crash down onto the floor, into like the cushions, like you saw on the couch. They might push into end range at their joints. So they kind of like wait there, maybe through their arms, with their elbows like fully extended and really lean into the end range of their joints. To feel more of that proprioceptive input at their joints. You might see them pulling on things, pushing things, hitting themselves, biting or pinching themselves. You saw that Malachi was biting the blanket. They might pull their own hair, bang their head into like the floor or the wall. You may see them running and jumping. So kids who are seeking auditory input, again, you might hear humming or singing or shrieking, yelling, that ear flicking, again, singing, like I said, grinding teeth and cupping their ears. They put their hand over their ears. It kind of gives a echoey kind of sound that kids kind of like, and they might even take their hand on and off the ear to make more of like a, I don't know what you call, like a vibrating sound. When kids are seeking tactile input, these kids you'll see putting things in their mouth, chewing on things, chewing on toys, chewing on the collar of their shirt, the sleeve of their shirt. They might crash into things. They might frequently touch either themselves, everything around them, or other people. So if you remember back from the video in the behavior lecture, Dylan was going over the schedule with Coach Ashley, and you saw him kind of start touching her hair. That's him, seeking tactile input, but it's not really socially acceptable. So you saw her kind of grab his hand in her hand and kind of hold his hand instead to stop him from touching her hair, and also to show him this is a more socially acceptable way that you can touch. These kids might crave strongly flavored foods. These are the kids that love those sour candies or hot sauce or, things that are really intensely flavored. Okay, so when do we intervene? So we have to ask, are the sensory seeking behaviors working for the child? Is it helping them stay focused? So there's a difference between the person who's fidgeting in their seat, but still able to learn and not distract everybody around them, as opposed to the child who is like running, jumping, bang, crashing into the walls, knocking their chair over. That's, a safety concern, and it's distracting to everybody. And they're still not even focusing on their work. Are the sensory behaviors helping them function? So that's the number one question. And if they are, then you have to ask, are the sensory seeking behaviors appropriate? Are they age appropriate? Are they socially acceptable? Are they harmful to themselves, or are they going to be harmful to somebody else? Do they take away from the child's ability to learn, or from others in the class, from their ability to learn? Are their behaviors destructive? So you can see the picture of the little girl who's probably getting some sensory stimulation by blowing raspberries, but if she's spitting on, her friends, and it's annoying to them because she's constantly making this noise, and that's a sensory seeking behavior that's not going to be appropriate and something that wants to be addressed. All right, so what are we going to do to intervene for the sensory seeker? So for these kids, we want to teach them self-management, self-awareness, recognize how their engine is running. Are they, slow and sluggish? Are they in the just right or calm alert state? Or is their engine running too high? And then you can give them options to self-treat that are more appropriate and safe. So, if a child's running too low, we might give them, things to do in the hallway, like jumping jacks or, headstands or whatnot. So they know there's like, a group of things that they can choose from when their body feels too low versus when they feel too high, to help regulate them. If we're going to give them some tactile input, so like I said, vibration kind of kicks into that vestibular sense. The vibrating toys or vibration massage, all those things will help kind of get back to that calm alert state. Brushing, there's a specific brushing protocol that we will talk about, although you need to be cautious with this population because sometimes it can have an adverse reaction. With proprioceptive input, we're going to introduce pushing and pulling and running and jumping, but it's going to depend on where they are, and that arousal level will depend on what we give them. Some self-calming devices like fidget toys are huge right now. I don't have my camera on. I brought a whole bunch for you to see, but you can't see them. So I have the Pop It. There's Simple Dimples. There's the fidget spinners. I have these little rings that kind of spin around each other. Those types of things are nice, especially if you have a child in like a gen ed class that needs something like that, that's little. You can have them keep it in their pocket and they can kind of fidget with it inside their pocket, so it's not disruptive. And it doesn't become a toy, it becomes more of a tool. As long as they keep it in their pocket, they can use it. And that could, sometimes that's just enough to keep them awake and alert. Stress balls are great. Again, those heavy weighted animals, the weighted vests, the weighted blankets. When we give auditory input, we could use a steady background of classical music, but they might need headphones because they might need to listen to it at a volume that's high enough to really register. And depending on their arousal level, we're going to think about giving them lots of change and unpredictability if their engine is running low, or if their engine is running high, that calming input. These are the kids that you want to talk to the teacher and give them opportunities throughout the day for appropriate movement breaks or frequent movement. So I'll show you some examples of like the ball chair, the move and sit. That kind of allows them to fidget a little in their seat, but it becomes a lot less disruptive. These are the kids that really do well with a sensory diet, where kind of you plan out their day and give them little sensory breaks, things to do, especially right before periods of like desk work where they have to really be seated and still for a while to kind of get them into that calm alert state before they have to do things like that. So top left is a ball chair, and these are great because it's on a chair with a backrest. The ball, can't roll all over the place, and those wheels, you can lock them. So you have the movement and they can bounce a little bit on the ball, and it promotes a nice upright trunk, but it's a little bit safer than just giving them a ball to sit on. These are little fidget toys. The little things move around. And then this is a wedge seat. So you see that it's got little dots on it, and that provides some tactile input, and it's wedge shaped, but it's also an inflated cushion. So the cushion gives them that little frequent movement that they can fidget on. But the wedge part gives them a better pelvic alignment and gets them out of a posterior pelvic tilt, which is nice for kids with lower tone and postural control issues. And also, some schools have those really molded bucket seats that kind of just force you to go into a posterior pelvic tilt. So these are nice to use with those kinds of seats. This is a Dynadisc or move and sit. You can use these too. These are a lot spikier, so it gives you a lot more input. And they're not wedge shaped. It's just a round cushion, but that's another option. These are just little balls with, different sensory feelings to them. Like I said, those are things I might give in a box for a child. And when they, when they're getting really touchy-feely, they need something to play with, they can go and, say, I need like some calming time with the box, and they can play with some of these toys. And this is just another fidget thing. Those rings kind of spin around each other. Okay, this is an example of how does your engine run, the whole program where kids learn, self-awareness. So you teach them to recognize when their arousal level is too low, when it's too high, and what to do to get it into that just right zone. Okay, so that was all the modulation disorders. Now we're getting into that second type, which is the sensory discrimination disorder. Okay, the vast majority of the kids you're going to run into are going to have modulation issues. They might also have, like I said, the other types, but modulation is what you're going to come across most often. So the sensory discrimination just touches you, your brain automatically asks, like, is this painful touch or is this okay? And in kids with this sensory discrimination disorder, it's not so easy to answer that question. So depending on, what's going on with the child, they might have difficulty judging how far away something is because they just can't discriminate their distance away from something else. They might have difficulty knowing how much force to use. So you might see these kids who are stomping their feet up the stairs. One, again, not judging how far the step is away from their foot, but also how much force they need to use to step on the step. Or you see this too in kids when they're throwing a ball to somebody, and their partner might be 3 feet away, but they're throwing their ball with all of their effort as if the child was 100 feet away. So it's that grading of force that becomes difficult. These kids get easily disorganized, and it's almost like they know they're losing their balance, but they don't have the proprioceptive sense to realize within their body what direction they're losing their balance in. These kids overly rely on vision to help them with balance. So you're going to want to tease that out with your tests. These kids have a difficult time with body awareness. Sometimes these are the kids that fall off their chair in class, and it's not because they're fidgeting around so much or rocking the chair. It's that they're slowly slipping towards the front or the side, and they don't realize how close they are to the edge until oops, they go over. And these kids have poor kinesthetic awareness. Okay, this is the good old foam and dome. This is the traditional one with the three different, with the vision open, eyes closed, and then with the dome. Now they've said you can take the dome away because it's pretty much just as reliable, just doing the foam and the eyes open and the eyes closed. But this you can really tease out, is the child having more of an issue with their proprioceptive sense, or is it more their visual? And any sway of less than 70 degrees is considered normal. You time how long they're able to stand in the different conditions. But just be aware, you need to, obviously you need to use this in a child that is able to follow directions. And have the awareness of you want them to stand as long as they possibly can. Okay. So some treatment ideas for kids with sensory discrimination disorder. So you want to warm up the system by giving input. So the kids that you're going to do some, rough play, some crashing, wrestling, jumping, slow and maintained co-contraction, almost like you're trying to put, like if you put your hand to hand and you lean in toward each other, you're trying to knock each other down. And it's that slow and held co-contraction that is kind of good for that proprioceptive input. Anything giving vibration, heavy work, bumping into things. You're going to introduce skills coincided with more sensory input. So anything with rough surfaces, like I said before, you might do catching with a medicine ball, or using ankle or wrist weights on, or the ball with the spiky sensory things on it, or you might use a pathway that's lit up, or whatever you can do to kind of almost like I said, like give a little extra bombardment of some sensory input. And then you do that while you're working on the skills. And then over time, you fade out that extra sensory input while continuing to work on the skill. So you want to see if the intensity of that sensory input as it decreases, if the skill is still maintained. All right, so now we're up to the last category, which is the sensory-based movement disorder, or the praxis postural control category. So this is when the motor output does not match what the sensory input is telling. There's going to be a lot of kind of carryover. There's a lot of gray area between the discrimination disorders and the movement disorders. But in general, these kids also have difficulty grading the control. But a lot of times you'll see that the motor planning, the sequencing, bilateral coordination is really difficult. They have a difficult time figuring out where they are in space and really using their proprioceptive and vestibular systems, but that's what you're going to kind of use to access them for learning. So this also is split up into two subtypes. So we have dyspraxia. You might also see somatodyspraxia or bilateral integration. And the second one is postural disorder or postural control. All right, so the dyspraxia, these are the kids where they're having trouble motor planning. So the sequencing of a movement, novel tasks are really difficult. These kids might appear clumsy, and it might be just in gross motor, it might be fine motor, it might be oral motor, it might be visual motor, it might be everything. These kids, parents will say that their milestones were somewhat delayed as an infant, but then they caught up, but the older child is having more difficulty with higher level coordination skills, like those jumping jacks and doing, participating in soccer with their friends, things like that. They might have poor handwriting, and it's not because, like, let's say the under responsive kid is going to be pushing so hard into the paper because they need all that extra input to kind of feel where they are. These kids have poor handwriting because they have difficulty with the coordinated effort to form the letters correctly. They might have trouble coloring and staying in the lines, because that again is requiring coordination, not only with your body, but with your eyes. These kids are going to have difficulty tying shoes, which is, a huge visual motor task, and it's very complicated for a lot of kids to learn. But these kids, especially, they might be in 4th and 5th grade and still can't tie their shoes. Dressing can be difficult because that's a lot of, sequencing and trying to figure out how to move your body to do it. Even doing their hair. These kids might have difficulty chewing because it's coordinating the, the muscles to chew, and they might drool because they're having trouble coordinating, like the swallowing while they're chewing. These kids might trip or bump into things because of poor spatial awareness. But the most important thing is these kids are often intelligent and they're aware. They're aware that they are not performing as well as their peers. I would say more often than not, these kids are also in that sensory under responsive, but not all the time. But these are the kids that wind up becoming um, involved in a lot of stationary extracurricular activities like video games, things like that. And, it's a debate where people will say, well, that's just them, that's what they're into. But you don't know if they're just into that because they've gotten so frustrated with movement that they've decided, it's just not worth it, that I'm happier to do this. Whereas if you gave them the tools to tap into some of these areas where they can show some improvement, they might really enjoy, physical activity and movement. All right, so what do we do for the kids with dyspraxia? So you're going to start with deep pressure to prepare for movement. Those types of things like rolling them into like a taco or going through that body roller. You're going to introduce proprioceptive activities like pulling, pushing, jumping. Give them vestibular movement breaks. But what you're really going to do is break down complex tasks into simple steps. You keep them simple and structured at first, and as they succeed, you can increase the complexity of the task. So for example, when I teach kids how to throw overhand, I break it down into 4 tasks with a verbal cue at each step so that they can practice it and know kind of where to position themselves before they put it together as a whole task. So I'll say, 1, step to the side. 2, put your hand to the back of your head. 3, take a step. 4, turn and throw. So they can practice that step by step by step. They'll know exactly how to move their body. You go slow at first and then increase the speed and decrease the time between each step until they're doing it as one fluid movement. Now, do I care that, what it looks like particularly? No, but do I want them to be functional? Yes. So if the way that they're throwing right now is so inefficient, you can only throw the ball 2-3 feet, well, that's going to be embarrassing to them. And they're going to say no when their friends on the playground ask them if he wants to play catch. So if I teach them the more efficient ways to move using those steps, then they can throw a longer distance. That's going to help their participation and their social interaction with peers. Like I said, we used verbalize the sequencing of the movement plan so that they're aware and they know exactly what they need to do at each step. And when you're offering advice on extracurricular activities, it's always good to focus on non-competitive activities, more individual sports. Soccer also, although has been shown to be very effective in the youth with this, type of movement disorder. But so that they can just focus on themselves, they don't have to worry about keeping up with everybody around them. Those types of activities are best. Peer modeling works great. You get a child of the same age with a little bit of a higher skill level, and that's very motivating, and the kids tend to learn a little bit more from that method. And then it comes down to repetition, 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 really breaking it down, practicing it and practicing it and practicing it. And these types of kids, you're not going to be able to do one thing that's going to carry over to all types of high coordination tasks. It's very task specific. So each task they're having difficulty with, you have to break down into those simple steps before you can, practice the whole task, before they can, master that one, and then you move on to the next one. Now, the last one we have in that sensory-based movement disorder category is the postural disorder, also known as postural control. So these kids can't physically meet the demands of motor tasks. Their core is really weak. and they have a decreased ability to co-contract and really stabilize. So they're having trouble, holding up their skeleton. They have low muscle tone. They get tired easily. You see them really slouch sitting at their desk. These are the type of kids that would probably do well with that move and sit cushion to kind of wake up their system, but also help get their pelvis aligned so they can be more upright. You often see this in combination with other subtypes, especially modulation disorders. So you want to check into that as well. These kids have poor grasp and poor handwriting because of the muscle strength that it takes to really hold on to the pencil, and the endurance for writing all the letters, all they have to write. These kids often change hands while they're writing because their dominant hand gets so tired they can't keep up with the class, so they switch to their other hand. And sometimes these kids just don't even have a dominant hand, whereas that dominance should come in anywhere between like 2 and 6 years old, and these might be kids who are still 8, 9, 10 years old, who are kind of using their hands equally. These kids have difficulty crossing midline. So if you remember that brain gym activity we did with the figure eights, these kids will have a really hard time with that. You're going to find they have decreased balance, and their tactile and proprioceptive systems are what's most affected. So what do we do for these guys? We activate their core. So lots and lots and lots of core work and endurance work. And then you're going to tap into those proprioceptive and tactile senses with all the things that we talked about and some of the things that we'll talk about after this. And then you're going to work on holding postures and co-contracting. This might be somewhere, like I said, use that wedged move and sit cushion, but also you might ask the teacher if he can use an easel or vertical surface at his desk, or stand sometimes and work up on the wall, tape his work to the wall, because I'll just encourage him to be a little bit more upright, and work on that holding his posture and not have to fight so hard against gravity as you do when you're leaning over on a desk. So we'll just go over some brief general sensory-based treatment ideas. All right, so for tactile activities, we talked about the brushing protocol, and I'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute. Introducing various textures. You can even brush different textures on the child's skin. So kids who are toe walkers, sometimes we do this on the bottom of their feet. You start with something very soft, very smooth, and as they tolerate it, you work up to more and more intense, sensory stimulation. So maybe some bumpy texture, a rough texture, towels, and you increase it that way. The rice or the bean bin. So you can have bins with, Orbeez or rice or beans or beads, and you can hide things in them, and they can either use their feet or their hands, whatever part of their body is either having, some defensiveness, or if they're really craving tactile, and they can dive in there and search around for those little toys while they're getting all of that tactile input to their skin. Shaving cream is something, and you saw that in the video in the beginning, where teachers will use or OTs will use to kind of learn how to form letters, but it's also, a very, very tactile, very intense experience. So sometimes with kids, we'll put shaving cream inside of a Ziploc bag. So they can kind of push the shaving cream around, but without actually touching it. And then you work your way up to like touching it and maybe putting gloves on and, using the shaving cream, either making letters or just, playing around with it. And then working your way up to taking the gloves off and actually like putting the shaving cream on their skin for certain periods of time, increasing that period of time. But you also have to be aware of the sensitivity to smells. So you might want to stay away from the shaving creams that are, scented with menthol or, whatever they are, because that can be just so overly stimulating for a child who's already defensive tactilely. If they also have some defensiveness with smells, that's just probably going to be overboard. Pin the tail on the donkey, depending on if you have like, tails and made out of yarn and different like textures, maybe a donkey on the wall that's a little fuzzy. So you're using all different tactile inputs for the child. High fives, it's a nice way to give praise if a child, needs tactile input. The tactile box is like a box that has like a cutout hole for your arm, and you can put your hand in there and touch different things to kind of figure out what it is. Sensory walk, which I'll show you in a second, and that can be either inside setup or you can do it outside, walking on, gravel and sand and wood chips and all sorts of things. You can put small objects or little beads in therapody and have the child kind of push and pull through the therapody to hunt for fish for the beads. Kinetic sand or that foam is a fun way to do some tactile stimulation. And also snow, there's this like artificial snow you can make that actually feels cold too. So now you're getting two different senses. It's really good for those kids who are really craving that tactile input. So this is an example of that sensory walk. So there's all different types of textures and the girl's gonna walk over it. Some are smooth, some are bumpy, some are rough. So it's really getting them to discriminate and feel the different textures. And this is one of those sensory bins. This looks like it's more Orbeez. And there's some shovels in there. There's some cups. They can just play around with it, or they can hunt and dive for little toys in there. Okay, proprioceptive activities. These are your, joint stimulation type activities, your weight bearing activities. So anything like crawling, pushing that laundry basket, or pushing the PT, sitting on the rolling stool. Excuse me, any heavy work, carrying a heavy backpack, doing push-ups, wall push-ups or push-ups on the floor. Jumping gives a lot of proprioceptive input to the ankles. Giving tight hugs. Steamroller is something that I use a lot and kids generally love it. If you have a child lay on the floor on a mat and you have them lay on their stomach and you take a large therapy ball and you put it on top of their body and you push some of your weight through the ball and you kind of slowly roll it up and down their body, on their legs, on their arms. And you can have them even roll over and roll on the front of their body. It's very calming and it gives a lot of deep input. I would suggest maybe you guys trying it when you're studying and you need a little bit of a break. You're starting to, lose your focus or you're getting a little sleepy or whatnot. Try the steamroller and see how it does for you. If you're feeling really anxious, get on the floor and get one of your fellow PT students to roll the ball. It works really nicely. Like I said, carrying a basket of books, that's nice heavy work. Using the weighted vest or weighted blanket. A lot of classrooms, especially the self-contained classrooms, will have a little area for kids to calm down. So they might have a little weighted blanket or those weighted animals. You can use a medicine ball. Doing a wheelbarrow activity, that's a lot of proprioceptive input into the upper extremities. Tug of war, although I would, a little caveat on that. You have to really pick the right type of kid to do tug of war with because it can be a little dangerous. Like I said, the heavy backpack, the taco or the hot dog, that is something where you have a kid lay on a blanket and they lay on the edge and they grab onto the edge of the blanket and they start rolling themselves up into a taco or a burrito. And then sometimes they'll even hold the bottom of the blanket and try to see if they can wiggle out, because that's a lot of proprioceptive input and heavy work trying to get themselves out of that. And swimming is full body proprioception. Okay, some vestibular activities. And like I said, you're going to cater this depending on the type of child. If you need to do slow and rhythmical, if you need to do more intense. So you have the trampoline, lots of things you can do on the trampoline, the sit and spin, which that little boy in the beginning was also using, a rocking horse, a swing, scooter boards. Doing yoga, the sun salutations, you're inverting your head and then lifting it back up. That's a lot of vestibular input. Human bowling, so that's where you could put some cones or some bottles around the room, and you have the child roll along on their side to all the different pins to try and knock them over. So that's a lot of rotational movement. So that's good vestibular input. Bouncing on a therapy ball, rocking on a therapy ball, um, slides, going down a slide in the playground, zip line, somersaults, that's rotational, so it's going to give you a lot of input. Swimming again, doing a game like Twister. So really anything that's getting the child's head moving is going to give vestibular input, and you're going to cater it depending on the type that the child needs. So there's an example of that sit and spin. And this is a platform swing that OTs use a lot. And you can use it on all different directions. You can rotate and swing side to side, forward and back. They can go on their stomach. They do a lot of rotational tests for like that vestibular ocular reflex on this platform swing. Just kind of beyond the scope of this lecture, but you'll see that a lot. And it's a barrel swing. Those things are super fun too. So you can go in lots of different positions in there and swing, forward to back, side to side. You can position it where it's close to a wall, and child, swings and then pushes their hand against the wall. You give that proprioceptive input as well. This is the Wilbarger brushing protocol. So it's using a specific type of brush, looks like a surgical brush, and it uses deep pressure, and you go in a back and forth movement in one direction. So when you use the brush, if you're holding it lengthwise and brushing up and down, it feels much different than if you go like side to side the long way. It's a lot scratchier. So you use that smoother movement with deep pressure, and you go up and down the arms, the back, the other arm, the legs, and then you follow that with joint compressions. And they say that this is good for kids with sensory modulation disorder, specifically used for kids who are over responsive to tactile input. It helps calm the body and be able to tolerate tactile input more. But they also say, it's good for attention and hyperactivity and all sorts of things like that. So the Wilbarger protocol requires that this input really only lasts, the good effects of it only lasts for about 90 minutes to an hour and a half. I'm sorry, that is an hour and a half, 90 minutes to 2 hours. So it really requires a full team effort, because the child is going to have to be brushed about every 90 minutes. So the mom or dad is going to have to do it in the morning. The teacher's going to have to do it when they get to class, or an aide or an OT or a PT. It's going to be done a couple times throughout the day, and the parents are going to have to take over at night. So it's a commitment to the family. And this is something that is going to be incorporated to that sensory diet, in the classroom. So they're going to have movement breaks. They're going to have the brushing, their joint compression. Like I said, it may not be great for the child who's sensory seeking, but we'll go into a little bit more detail about the research with the brushing protocol a little bit later. But that's what the Wilbarger brushing protocol is. Okay, therapeutic listening is another type of program that is geared towards kids with the modulation disorders. So it's an individualized program. It uses music that is specifically modulated for specific frequencies, the use of specific instruments and types of rhythms, and the amount of bass that's going to cause your eardrum to vibrate. And it's thought to exercise the muscles of the inner ear. So we all have that thing that like kind of shuts down our inner ear when we hear something really loud, and they're thinking that these kids, that muscle's not working as well or as quickly. So it's kind of exercising that muscle to work faster and be able to shut down the inner ear so that they're not having to expose themselves to these loud noises. It's also thought to stimulate the vestibular system. We said that vibration and that humming and that inner ear are all connected to the vestibular system. There's a specific protocol for duration and frequency. The kids usually do it all throughout the day, on and off. And they have to use that specific type of headphones. And it's at a low volume. So the child can still be in class, listen to the teacher, have a conversation with someone, but this is kind of like off in the background. And they say it's good for kids with auditory defensiveness, difficulties with attention, those different types of modulation disorders, postural issues, dyspraxia, sleep difficulties, community, to give you a different sensations in a dark room with different sounds, developed in the Netherlands, and it's really aimed to really calm down the body, calm any type of agitation, improve engagement. And you're starting to see these now also in geriatric settings, nursing homes, because with some of the older population that become agitated and kind of irritable and have some sensory issues themselves, they found that this has been helpful. So here's a little example.
This is an AMI This Week shortcut.
I'm Kelly McDonald for Accessible Media in Toronto. At the Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital, there are plenty of places for children to play and explore. There are also quite a few therapeutic spaces as well. Lorraine Thomas is the Snoezelen coordinator at Holland Bloorview, and she looks after the community program at the hospital.
So the word snoezelen is Dutch originally. It's made up of two words. Snuffelen, meaning to seek out or to explore, and doezelen, meaning to relax or to be in a wonderful place. The snoezelen concept started about 35 years ago in the Netherlands, and it was developed by a psychologist and a music therapist, and they worked in a facility for adults with severe disabilities. What they wanted was to create a space where their clients could actually enjoy the room and be exposed to sensory stimulation.
A typical Snoezelen room is designed to stimulate various senses using lighting effects, color, sound, music, or scent. Lots of different materials are used to achieve this, including fiber optics, tactile maps, buttons, and switches. Children with a wide range of disabilities can benefit from this therapeutic space.
What we tell parents is that snoezelen is really about making sense of the senses. So when you go into the room, you may have a child who's very anxious. And just by virtue of creating a space that is calming, you can reduce that level of anxiety. And when someone's less anxious, they're more open to learning. Or conversely, you might have someone easily stimulated. You can go into the room and reduce the level of sensory overload and calm that individual down.
After my own personal experience in the Snoezelen room, I can totally understand about the positive reaction and what great stimuli the children must get. For example, myself, walking on the musical hopscotch was great. I could see the lights dancing. I could hear the music.
I know I had my favorites in the room, and so does James. He and his mom, Andrea, visit one of the many Snoezelen spaces at Holland Bloorview often.
He loves the bubble tube and watching the bubbles and the lights change. Given that James has a lot of difficulty with his vision and we're not sure how well he sees or where he sees, and he seems to prefer environments that are not as brightly lit, I thought that would be an excellent environment for him to be able to experience.
James has a condition called fumarate deficiency, a disorder that causes severe developmental disabilities and impacts movement. Andrea notices some key differences in James when he visits the room.
In the past, he used to be very high toned, so his muscles would be really rigid. And when we would come into the Snoezelen room, he would immediately start relaxing and his muscles would relax. He's usually more alert. He's able to open his eyes much wider than he normally does. And he definitely focuses on the movements and the lights much longer than when he's not in the Snoezelen room.
Andrea feels.
So that's an example of the Snoezelen room. You see that, especially in centers that focus on kids with autism spectrum disorder. Also, another alternative therapy when kids are having sensory processing disorder is hippotherapy, which we just went over this past week. So, like I said, when you initially start working with the horse, the child participates in grooming the horse. They're getting a tactile sensation. They're getting warmth from the horse. When they're up on the horse, they feel the horse's, what is it? It's not fur, hair. You know what I'm talking about. So they're getting a whole bunch of different tactile sensations just from the horse. Then their vestibular sense is being stimulated by the movement on the horse, using the different types of horse gaits, different positions that they're being put on the horse. And then for kids to be able to hold up their body on the horse, that's working on maintaining postural support. So you're tapping into a lot of those different senses, the tactile, vestibular, and the proprioceptive, which we try to get to when we have kids with sensory processing disorders. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about standardized outcome measures. These are going to be mostly used by OTs. You can use them, but just so you have an awareness of what they are if you encounter them. So we have the Sensory Profile 2, and that was created by Winnie Dunn. It was updated in 2014. That is good for kids birth to 14 years. This is just a reference for you guys to look back to if you need to. Don't praise yourself over knowing all this stuff. The administration time is quick. It's about 10 to 15 minutes, and it is norm referenced, and it's specifically used for sensory modulation disorders. It's trying to identify which system is having an issue, and is it over responsive, under responsive, seeking, yada yada. You can answer these questions via clinical observation or using caregiver input or teacher input. And this is used really in aiding treatment planning and knowing, what to do for these kids, where to intervene, what systems. Okay, then you have the sensory integration and praxis test, or the SIP. This was created by good old Jean Ayers. You should recognize that name. This is used for kids between 4 and almost 9, just under 9 years old. And it's a comprehensive assessment for sensory processing, but it does not test for modulation dysfunction. There's 17 subtests. Some of them are things like space visualization, standing and walking balance, design copying, postural praxis, bilateral coordination, etc. The administration time is about 2 hours to do a complete test, or 10 minutes per subtest, and you are able to pick and choose if you want to just do 1 or 2 or 5. And this is normed against a reference sample of 2,000. The cost of this whole kit is $1,300. They used to have a certification program that you had to go through. It was about like a 2-week certification, I believe, in order to administer this test. They have since phased that out, but it's offered in other ways through other places, not by the people who make the test. And that certification goes for about $2,000 to $3,000 depending on where you go. Then we have the DeGangi-Burke test of sensory integration, made by Georgia DeGangi and Ronald Burke, hence the name. This is good for kids between 3 and 5 years of age. So you're looking at that preschool population. It takes about a half hour to administer. The cost of this one is about $277, so definitely less expensive than the other. But this one's criterion referenced. It's not going to give you a norm referenced statistic. But this is sensitive to the early detection of sensory processing disorders. It measures sensory integration with subdomains of postural control, bilateral motor integration, and reflex integration. It has less reliability and validity for the reflex integration subtest, but the others have shown better reliability. And if you're using it for kids on the autism spectrum, it's really better for those kids who have good attention and receptive language. Okay, then we have the test of sensory function in infants. This is by DeGangi, but another Dr. Greenspan. And this is for the younger kids, so 4 to 18 months. This measures sensory processing and reactivity, and supposedly those at risk for future learning disabilities, but they haven't really been shown good reliability with being able to predict at 18 months old who's going to have a learning disability in the future. The administration time is about 20 minutes. The cost of the kit is about the same, $277. And this measures reactivity to deep pressure, vestibular stimuli, visual tactile integration, adaptive motor function, and ocular motor control. And then we have a good old Peabody. This does not specifically look at sensory processing, but it will give you some ideas in visual motor and how they're able to coordinate, and then also with a higher level coordination skills and some ball skills. The school function assessment is something else that you guys have learned about. This is a nice way to learn from the team and to discuss as the team where the child is really having the most difficulty in school, to be able to create a plan and measure progress within those difficulties. It's criterion referenced, but this is a really good place to start if you're working with school-age kids, to really tease out what are the issues that this kid, where is this kid having trouble functioning in school, and where can we address? And then you have the PD, which you guys know about the PD. Again, not specific to sensory processing, but we'll give you some information on functional skill. So what does the research say? So strength of SI research is low, but more results seem to be more promising on its effectiveness on motor skill development, which, hey, I don't know about you, but I'm kind of interested in that. That's kind of, what we're doing. So if the research is saying, this might be a good window into helping these kids learn their motor skills, then, I'm listening. There's emerging evidence for the Wilbarger brushing protocol for modulating cortisol and improving behavior and social participation, but studies are limited and the quality of those studies are not so great. There is a study that showed improvement in it was only 2 children. So one child got the Wilbarger protocol and the other used a non-specific protocol. So it wasn't as regimented as the Wilbarger. Kind of used the child to say, like, I need to be brushed now. That type of thing is based on need. And they showed improvements in both areas. So they're kind of saying, maybe you don't need to be as rigid, doing it every 90 minutes all day long, as you think with the Wilbarger protocol. The people who design the Wilbarger protocol will say that if you don't do it in the, specific way, you can actually, harm the child. So this study, although, limited in scope, is kind of saying the opposite. Like, not only will you not harm them, but it might actually be just as effective and a lot easier to do. But interestingly enough, the 2 cases, they talked about tactile defensiveness as one of the children's issues, which is something that you would use the brushing for, but in the discussion of the results, never mentioned the effect on their tactile sensitivity. So that remains to be seen. Evidence supporting weighted vests tends to be weak, but what support there is, it appears to improve on-time task in children with ADHD. So the ability to focus for longer periods at the task at hand. Systematic review results tend to be a little bit more mixed. Okay, so, and that's kind of the big main theme, is that a lot of the research shows mixed results. But the problem tends to be that you're not really using a heterogeneous group. Kids with sensory issues can change by the day or by the hour. And treatment has to really be very child specific and alters all the time depending on the child's state at the moment. So it's very hard to get a consistent methodology when you have that much variability. We're starting to see some more evidence for some types of intervention, but we can't really quite say that this is an evidence-based medicine approach yet. Like I said, there's problems with the methodology. There is some supportive evidence with lower level studies. However, like we talked about with the complementary and alternative medicine, lab, anecdotal evidence can be important. So the way you think about it is, as PTs, am I doing sensory integration, the quote unquote typical OT guided sensory integration treatment to fix this child's sensory system so over time they won't have these sensory issues anymore? No, that is not why I am doing these strategies. Why I'm doing these sensory strategies is to help the child get into that calm alert state so they're available to learn in my session. If their body is so focused on getting that vestibular input, I could be the best therapist in the world, but they're not going to be able to focus on me or take in anything that we're trying to do for the session. So we're really looking more at the immediate response that the sensory treatment gives the child versus a cure over the long term. So they might be going to OT and doing this sensory integration treatment, hoping that over time it regulates their sensory processing and they won't have these issues anymore. But for me, I'm really using it to tap into their body, get them calm alert, get them organized so that they can learn. All right, and one more video, but I think it's so worth it. So we're going to assess this doggy to see what kind of sensory processing this doggy might have.
It's okay. It's okay, Pug. We have like 1.5 more to go. I know it's hard. Okay. Pug. Pug, you have to stop. It's okay. Pug. Pug. Chill. Okay.
Oh my God, this dog kills me. So no, I'm not saying that we need to diagnose this pug with the sensory processing disorder. It was just more fun because I love that little clip and it makes me laugh every time. But if you think about some kids who a very simple regular life experience like that, like cutting nails, could be that stressful. So that's what the sensory integration is all about. It's just there to help you, just like the behavior lecture, to help you be able to accomplish what you need for your sessions. So just like anything else, if you have any questions, email me. I'll stay after class on Thursday or Wednesday. But if that's it, then I will see you guys soon.